subject of today's class is institutions. This is a subject of immense importance, and the argument today serves as a way to connect the study of economics with the study of social theory and with the central ambitions of politics. Institutional order must be of central importance in economics. If we start from the premise that a market order has no single natural and necessary institutional form. The alternative institutional arrangements of the market shape the arrangements of production and exchange, the way in which we produce, the way in which we trade, and the distinction between change in institutions and compensatory redistribution as a background to equalization is also of fundamental importance. A continuing theme in the course, and a theme to which I will return next week, is that the attenuation of inequality that arises from structural change is much more important than the attenuation that results merely from compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. Now let me begin by presenting the topic in its social theoretical context. The effort to preserve or change the regime is the fundamental object of political ambition. And the regime is the name that is classically given in the history of political and social thought to the basic institutional and ideological structure of society. The theme that is addressed by Aristotle in his theory of regimes, then by Montesquieu, and then in the whole history of modern social thought. And the elucidation of regimes, of how to think about them, and of how to understand their transformation, is the central topic of social theory. Now, let's begin with the idea of regimes or of institutional and ideological structure in Marxism. Because after all, Marxism was both the culminating achievement, Marxist theory of society and history, of classical European social theory, and the set of ideas that has ever since had the greatest influence on the progressives and on the left. The central insight in classical European social theory and in Marx's version of it is that the structures of society, the basic institutional order and the institutional assumptions, the ideological assumptions associated with the institutional order are artifacts, that they are our invention, that we should not think of them as if they were natural phenomena, part of the furniture of the universe. We made them. And as Vigo already argued at the end of the 18th century, because we made them, we can understand them. We can understand them intimately, from within, with internal knowledge, in the way that the Creator understands His creation. And not just from the outside, the way we would understand, for example, the atomic structure of a natural phenomenon. Now, we can deepen and radicalize this central insight in the following metaphorical way. Imagine, as I believe I suggested in a previous class, a game of musical chairs. The music goes on for a certain time. When the music stops, everyone sits down on the chairs. The chairs are the structure. The chairs are the crystallized residue of our struggles with one another, about the terms of our access to one another, and especially about the terms on which we engage in conflicts over the future. Conflicts about the way in which we use the crucial resources of political power, economic capital, and cultural authority to create the future within the present. So in every historical circumstance, in every social situation, there is a basic formative context, a formative institutional and ideological context, which shapes the surface routines of society. And especially the routine conflicts over the making of the future within the present. The conflict, that is the music in my metaphor, never stops altogether. It only stops relatively, and it is only interrupted temporarily. And insofar as it is contained and interrupted, the structures arise. They are the crystallized residue of our fighting with one another. That's the basic radical idea of structure in classical European social theory, and especially in Marxism. This radical insight into the made-up character of the structures, their artifactual nature, their relation to us, they're a kind of frozen politics, that's what the structures are, was circumscribed in classical European social theory by a series of illusions, which we could call the illusions of false necessity, which to some extent dulled their significance and hollowed out their content. The first such illusion of false necessity is that there is a closed set, a menu of the different regimes that can exist in history. And these regimes are enacted one by one in the order of the historical laws determining their enactment. So in Marxism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism are the modes of production. The second illusion of false necessity is that each of these regimes is an indivisible system. If it changes all at once. All of its pieces imply one another, all fit together into a system. The third illusion is the illusion of historical laws. That there are laws governing not just the operation of each of these systems, for Marx especially capitalism, studied in his masterwork, Capital, but also laws governing the succession of these regimes in history. Their foreordained enactment. These illusions have decisive consequences, not just for understanding, but also for political action. The implication of the combination of the first illusion, the illusion that there's a closed menu of regime options, and the illusion that there are laws governing the succession of the regimes, is that history has a project for us. We don't have to have a project. In fact, we can't have a project. The project is being prepared for us by this mechanism of the succession of regimes in history. The implication of the second illusion the indivisibility illusion, the illusion that each of the regimes is an indivisible system, is a binary idea of politics. There are two kinds of politics, according to this view. There's the reformist management of one of these regimes or indivisible systems, and there is the revolutionary substitution of one regime by another. Now, what has happened, broadly speaking, loosely speaking, in the subsequent intellectual history of these ideas? What has happened is that they have been experienced as being literally incredible in the light of practical political experience and historical learning, and they have been then diluted. Diluted, for example, by cultural Marxism, which insists on the relative autonomy of culture or consciousness from the base of the regimes, or political Marxism, which emphasizes the relative autonomy of politics from the structure. They have been diluted but not replaced. Very few people who are alive believe literally in these assumptions of false necessity, these illusions of false necessity. But they continue to use the vocabulary of class conflict, of capitalism. The vocabulary only has a precise meaning in the context of the theory, and taken out of the theory, it loses any precise meaning. And from this combination of continued use of the vocabulary and disbelief in the heroic assumptions of the theory, there arises an immense amount of confusion and disorientation. So the general tendency has been to try and preserve the meaning of the system of ideas by watering it down rather than by radicalizing its central insight and finding a way other than the illusions of false necessity to account for the reality of constraint on transformative action in history. Now, these statements are, of course, provocative because they are attacks, they're criticisms on the set of ideas that has had the greatest centrality for the progressives and the left in modern history. And so I first want to ask whether any of you would like to comment on this account that I gave of the ideas and of their failings. So, what, yes? Yes.
Well, I think that the problem with capitalism is that it's not really an idea. It's a system of exchange. And so I understand
Louder.
the structural analysis of Marxists and the post-Marxist schools,
Yes.
like Frankfurt School and all that. But the reason that we can't seem to get out of capitalism is that it's not really an ideology so much as a system of exchange. Like, for instance,
So a skeptic would say what we are using the word capitalism to describe is the present form of the market order.
yeah.
What do we get out of the additional thesis that this present form of the market order is the instantiation of a recurrent, indivisible type in history? That's the question.
But how do you, like, for instance, you could have an anti-capitalist message. I can put it on a T-shirt and I can sell it and everyone will buy it and we all agree capitalism is wrong.
But what does it mean? what does capitalist or anti-capitalist mean? What is the essential element of capitalism? For example, in Marxist theory, there are a number of alternative accounts of what is it that distinguishes capitalism. One of them is that capitalism is the system under which labor can be bought and sold, as opposed to other ways of organizing a market in which labor would not be subject to alienation, to buying and selling. Another account is the system in which the means of production are controlled by private owners, and the private owners are driven by a relentless logic of profit and accumulation, and so forth. But in order for it to have a precise meaning, we have to choose, and we have to determine it's this or that, and then presumably we have to make the further claim that that particular trait of what we're calling capitalism is necessarily and indissolubly connected with all the other traits. So a market order has emerged or re-emerged at many moments in world history. For example, in the great agrarian and bureaucratic empires, which after all have been the major entities, the main protagonists in world history. But most of these forms of the market don't have all of the characteristics that Marx and his followers associated with capitalism. My worry is not just a theoretical worry about the use of the term in comparative social theory. My worry is practical. So I start from the premise that a market order has no natural and necessary form. That has no singular form. That is an invitation to reimagine the market, to reshape it. And in this course, we're discussing that reimagination in three main contexts. The relation of the vanguard to the rest of the economy, which was what we discussed in the previous 2 weeks. And then after the spring break, the relation of labor to capital and the relation of finance to production. Those then become the focal points around which we discuss the reshaping of the market order. But how can that be reconciled with this use of the word capitalism? Is capitalism then just one form of this market order? And then does it come together with this assumption that all of the traits that we associate with that simplified, idealized form necessarily go together? That's an incubus. That's a constraint on our ability to reimagine and to transform. Now, then further, let me say this. Many of the people who govern society, countries in the world today, in the ruling circle, the ruling element, are ex-Marxists. They are skeptical, institutionally conservative social democrats. And the way they think is the following. They think, what is real change? Real change would be the revolutionary substitution of one regime by another, and specifically of capitalism by socialism. This system, whatever it is to be replaced by another system. Now, we don't have a clear idea of what the system that's being replaced is, because for the most part, we no longer believe in this heroic idea that the system is indivisible. And of course, we don't have an idea, a clear idea of what the alternative is. So then the person thinks, well, this revolutionary substitution is not in the cards. If it were in the cards, it would probably be too dangerous. So what is left for us to do? What is left for us to do is to humanize the present order, to make it less savage, to make the market order less savage. And we will have as our project, we the progressives, we the left, the project of our conservative adversaries, with a humanizing discount, will be the people who provide the sugar. In this way, the revolutionary idea, the binary idea of politics, the idea of capitalism, is turned on its head. It's turned upside down. And is made an alibi for its opposite, which is the notion that what's left for us to do is the humanization of the present order, humanization rather than transformation. That's what worries me. And what I don't want then is for the body of social theory to be an invitation to this kind of prostration, resignation. That's the practical interest that is behind this apparently theoretical dispute about the meaning of capitalism. Yes? Yes?
I'm following what you're saying, and I'm wondering, like, this tension that you're describing between, for example, the idea of capitalism, the idea of any of these ideologies, and then what we see in practice, whether we can call it capitalism or an example of one. I mean, isn't that just true of all language and all ideas? This is like, that, I don't know, let's say, so capitalism, let's say we're discussing the idea of like Christianity or something. Like, what is in theory described by that word and the forms of it that we see? Well, there will always be some gaps. Not every element maybe is true practice and so on. And so I'm trying to understand what makes
so this
the word
is
so much about.
I see where you're going. So it seems to me that you're saying this isn't a problem specific to social theory. This is a problem about essentialism with respect to ideas, the reification of concepts. But I don't think it really is that, because I mean, we can have a dispute about what makes a religion, for example. Did St. Paul invent Christianity? Did he reinvent the religion of Christ? Is the religion of Christ different from the religion of the of the followers of Christ after St. Paul and so on? That kind of a dispute. And indeed, religion has no fixed meaning. The concept of religion is an 18th century concept, which came with a whole baggage. It was associated with Protestantism, with the middle period in the history of Protestantism, in which there was a privatization of religious consciousness. And now, does that mean that we can't use it? No, we can use it so long as we are attentive to our meaning. So there are a number of people who say we can't use this concept of religion because it's associated with the moment in the history of theology in which we imagine this privatization of religious consciousness, a religion that has a message, as for the most part religion really must, about the organization of society, can't be described as a religion in that 18th century Protestant sense. Of course not. So then we correct this meaning. But there's no reason why we have to allow Madison and Schleiermacher to govern from the grave our use of the meaning of words. So that's how we would continue that dispute. We would say, the normal form of religion is a form which seeks to penetrate all of social life. And it's not just about individual conduct. It's this view of what religion was in the middle period of Protestantism is an anomaly in the history of religion. So we'll correct our use of the concept. Now when we're discussing this problem in classical European social theory, it's different. Because classical European social theory is making a particular claim. The claim is that there are regimes that shape the surface of conflicts of social life and account for what is most important about a society. That these regimes come in the form of a closed set or menu, as I called it, of institutional options. That each of these options is an indivisible system, and then the enactment or succession of this indivisible system is governed by foreordained laws. Now, are those assumptions true or false? That's the issue. I'm saying they're false. But apart from their being, on my claim, false, I'm making another claim, which is that no one believes in them empirically. Very few people are these hardcore Marxists that now believe in them. But they continue to use the vocabulary of the system as if they believed in it. And that's a source of self-deception and confusion. The self-deception and confusion becomes practically relevant in the way that I just illustrated. When it becomes then a reason, an alibi for disorienting transformative ambition in the way that I just suggested. Becomes an invitation to this humanization exercise. That's where it becomes relevant. So that's as it were the beginning of the dispute. Now, in contemporary social science, what has happened in contemporary social science? To paint the picture in a very broad way, what has happened is that the illusions of false necessity have been dismissed, but only because the revolutionary insight was buried. The revolutionary insight was that there are these structures, they have a fateful effect on social life. We made them, we don't recognize them as being our creations, and therefore we don't understand that we can recreate them. That's the central point. That was the central point in Marx's critique of English political economy. The English political economists present as the universal laws and perpetual laws of an economy what are only the laws of a particular form of economic organization. The revolutionary significance of that insight, that it's all revisable, that it's all politics, that it's frozen politics, is what is being congealed or circumscribed by what I enumerated as the illusions of false necessity. That's the practical import of the dispute. It's a dispute about something specific. So it's really not like that dispute about whether religion has an essential meaning. The essential is the question of reification of concepts. Now, so what has happened then in the subsequent history of social science? I say, it has disposed of the illusions of false necessity only by dismissing the revolutionary insight. It should have been the opposite. Instead of diluting the insight through cultural Marxism, political Marxism, the insight should have been preserved and radicalized, pushed to the hilt against the illusions of false necessity, which are dulling the significance of the insight. Now, of course, we need to have a social theory that accounts for the reality of constraint. We're not omnipotent. That would be pure voluntarism. But we have to account for the reality of constraint in history, constraint on transformative action, without evoking all these ghosts which deny our transformative freedom. So we have to account for transformative constraint in a way that recognizes the nature of our transformative freedom. So take, for example, that second illusion of false necessity, the idea of indivisibility. Its implication is, basically, there are two kinds of politics. There's reformism, which is humanizing, managerial, technocratic, and there's revolution. Now, revolution seems like a fantasy, because what does it mean? Is it like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution? These are historical ghosts, which we are unable to see as available in our own historical circumstance. If they were available, we would think they would be too dangerous, because look what happened after the Russian Revolution. Look what happened after the French Revolution, and so forth. So what's left to do? The reformist management, managerial, humanizing, and so forth. The claim that I'm making is a particular claim. It's a false idea. This binary idea of politics is false. Real structural change, when it happens, is almost always fragmentary and piecemeal. And every piecemeal change, every partial change in the structure can be either an excuse not to go further to the next step, or a step to the next step. It always has this ambivalence. This is the nature of real transformation in history. So we shouldn't want, and we don't need, a system of ideas that is disguising the real character of historical transformation. That's what's in question. Now come the contemporary social sciences. And their general tendency, I want to claim, is to cast a patina of naturalness, necessity, and authority over the present arrangements of social life. So in this sense, if we put them in the context of the history of philosophy, we can describe the main spirit of contemporary social science and policy discourse as a right-wing Hegelianism. The spirit is the idea, the real is rational. But each social science embarks on this right-wing Hegelianism by cutting in a distinct way the connection between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. How do we understand any phenomenon in nature or society? We understand it by understanding what it can become. If we think of the phenomenon as not transformable by anything, we don't understand it. We just stare at it. And then we produce a retrospective rationalization of it. To understand anything is to imagine its transformation. That's what understanding is. And so we have to take from the phenomena its something of its brute facticity and imagine it as one of a number of possibilities. Not ultimate possibilities, but accessible possibilities. The theirs to which we can get from here. That is the fundamental character of insight. So, and the nature of the imagination. Kant says the central move of the imagination is distancing from the phenomena. That's only the first move of the imagination. The second move of the imagination is to subsume the phenomenon under a range of accessible transformations. And it is by that subsumption of the actual under a range of accessible possibles that we understand it, that we imagine it, and then that imagination can inform our transformative action in the world. Now, each social science cuts this link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible in a different way. So this is why I say in one of these texts that I assign, it's like the beginning of Anna Karenina. And Tolstoy says, every happy family is a life, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The unhappiness, the peculiar unhappiness of the social sciences is their way of severing this vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. Economics does it in a unique way. The economics created by the marginalists at the end of the 19th century does it in a way that no other social science does. The only close analogy to it is Hans Kelsen's Pure Theory of Law, which was the most influential theory of law in the 20th century in the world. Although it may not be the object of study here and now, it was the most influential theory. It's the closest analog to this marginalist economics. So, the immediate trigger for marginalism and for the break with classical economics came before marginalism. was the attempt to cut through the mystifications about value. Classical economics was entangled in a series of disputes and confusions about value, use value, exchange value, and so forth. And the discussion of the theory of value was an attempt to bridge two problems, or to perform two tasks at the same time. One is to explain what is the ultimate source of wealth, the creation of wealth. The other was the explanation of relative prices. And so this produced endless confusion in pre-marginalist economics, which the marginalists cut through. They imagined the economy as a series of connected markets. In each market, the individual economic agent seeks to maximize the satisfaction of his goals and desires through judgments, through comparative judgments under the constraints of scarcity. The Austrian economists, this was one wing of marginalism at the end of the 19th century, understood correctly that this economics was not really a causal science and never intended to be a causal science. It was a form of logic, a species of logic. Because this model of maximizing comparative choice under the conditions of scarcity was a model that allowed for the application of deductive reasoning in the explanation of economic problems. And that, by the way, is the source of a mystery in economics, which is the following. You may know that the economists revere mathematics, and mathematical proficiency is one of the main requirements for professional formation in economics, and they insist on this mathematical model making in their discipline. But almost all of the mathematics used in economics would be described by a mathematician as toy mathematics. So there's no mathematics used in contemporary economics that was invented after the middle of the 19th century. So it's basically all calculus and variations on it. Now, what's the explanation? It's not that these people aren't clever. That there's no high mathematics. Why is there no real mathematics in economics when the economists so revere mathematics? The answer is very simple. It would have no use, because the use of this very simple mathematics, this toy mathematics, is to expound deductive reasoning. And the only kind of reasoning that's necessary, basically, in this economics, is deductive reasoning. So there's nothing for any other mathematics to do in this economics. That's the reason. And so then we have this mystery in the contemporary economics, which is there's a lot of empiricism. They use statistics and empirical methods to describe all sorts of data, and there's a lot of formal model making. But the formal model making and the empiricism have almost nothing to do with each other. They're dissociated. That's not like any real science. In any real science, you have models, you have methods. When the models don't, if there's an accumulation of failures in the models, ultimately there's a crisis in the theory, in the theoretical paradigm. Here, in this economics that the marginalists created, the underlying theory, the essence of which is what I just described, this maximizing choice under constraints of scarcity in a competitive market, is nothing that could ever be falsified, because it's an idealization, which then is the basis for the application of deductive reasoning. So if a model, so what the economist does is, against this background picture, methodological individualism, comparative maximization under constraints of scarcity, formulates a model to describe a particular reality against the background of this picture. If one model doesn't work, he simply produces another model by changing the elements of the model or the values of the parameters. That's what goes on. The substitution of one model by another never produces a crisis in the theory. It can't, because the theory was designed by the marginalists to be invulnerable. And this apparent virtue of invulnerability is in fact what condemns this kind of economics to an eternal infancy. Because it's not in the interest of a real science to be invulnerable in its theoretical paradigm. The interest is to render the theoretical paradigm vulnerable to the greatest degree possible to empirical subversion. But you can't attack marginalist economics by saying the real economic agents are not maximizing, rationalizing automata. The economists, very correctly, shrug that criticism off as being a misunderstanding of their methods. It was never meant to be descriptive. It was meant to provide a benchmark of idealization against which they could produce these models. So you substitute one model by another model with no implication for the subversion of the theory. It's just like Groucho Marx says, I have principles, and if you don't like them, I have other ones. That's the basic characteristic of this economics. It's dissociation of formal analysis from empiricism, and its creation of an invulnerable theoretical model. That's the first criticism of this. So I'm trying to provide a criticism which is not like that stupid criticism, which is it's maximizing, rationalizing action, which the economists laugh at, correctly. Now, the second criticism is that this economics that the marginalists produced has in it no theory of production. It is a theory of, it is purely a theory of exchange, of comparative exchange in competitive markets. If you open an economic textbook today, you can find in it a chapter called The Theory of Production or Production. But when you look at the chapter, you'll see that there's almost nothing that we would describe as production in it. It's about comparative substitution of factors. Factor substitution, organization of markets in relation to factor substitution, and so forth. For the classical economists, including for the two greatest thinkers in the history of economics, Adam Smith and Marx, the theory of production and the theory of exchange had equal centrality. They had a theory of production that was at the same level as the theory of exchange. In this economics, there's no real theory of production. For example, there's no body of ideas about the subject we've discussed over the last 2 weeks, the relation of the vanguard of production to the rest of the economy. That it simply disappears, it's not there. Even though, for Marx and Smith, that was the most important thing. They said, the way to understand the economy and its possibilities of transformation is to study the most advanced practice of production in the historical epoch. Because the most advanced practice of production is the one that most fully reveals our human powers. Now, there is a contingent fact about these economies which facilitates the reduction of the world of production to the world of exchange. And that is that in these economies, labor can be bought and sold. And that facilitates then looking at a crucial aspect of the production system from the standpoint of relative prices, the price of labor. And seeing then labor as just a factor of production which can substitute for the other factors, capital and technology. And that's why the chapter called The Theory of Production in the economic textbook has the content or the non-content that it does. Now, a third feature of this theory is the following, and I'm going to explain it by comparison to the neo-Darwinian paradigm in the life sciences. In the life sciences, there's a theory of competitive selection. That's a theory of Darwinian natural evolution. And there's a theory of genetic mutation and recombination, which is a theory of the creation of the diverse stuff on which the method of competitive selection operates. And one part of the theory wouldn't work adequately without the other, because if all we had was the theory of selection, we wouldn't know anything about how the actual process works. The creation of the diverse, the fecundity of a method of comparative selection depends entirely on the richness of the material from which the comparative selection selects. So there has to be a theory of both. Now, in this economics, the economics that the marginalists created, there is a theory of comparative selection, this view of the market, of maximizing choice under the constraints of scarcity and in the context of competition. But there's no theory of the creation of the diverse stuff on which the method of comparative from which the method of comparative selection selects. So it's as if in the life sciences we had only the half about Darwinian evolution, and we could ask, well, where's the other half? Well, we could ask that here. Now, the consequence is the following. From the standpoint of this economics, there's no reason why the world should be divided into sovereign states. The division of humanity into sovereign states and into different economic systems has no properly economic significance. It would be much better if the world were a uniform state from a purely economic standpoint, because then there would be no transactions costs of having different states, different laws, different rules. It would be just one state, a single world economy, and an equilibrium in that world economy. So it's an enigma why, from a narrowly economic point of view, why the world should be divided up into sovereign states and why these states should have different ways of organizing production and exchange. It's an enigma or it's an embarrassment. It's much better to have a uniform state. So those are the first three criticisms. Now I come to the criticism on which I want mainly to focus, which is the fourth criticism, the deficit of institutional imagination, especially institutional imagination about the market itself, the subject we were discussing at the beginning in relation to our conversation about the concept of capitalism. From the standpoint of the institutional ideas, the marginalist tradition has three kinds of economics. There are three varieties of economics from the institutional standpoint. The first is pure economics. Pure economics, the pure analysis of equilibrium, makes no institutional assumptions and has no institutional implications. So general equilibrium analysis, as it was developed in the mid-20th century, was shown to apply to a command economy just as much as to a market economy. This was the dispute between a concrete debate that took place in the mid-20th century in economics, the result of which was to demonstrate that there was no analytical obstacle to the generalized application of this economics to any economic system, including a command economy. So that's pure economics. So pure economics is coherent, it's consistent, but its strategy is pure. I'm not to blame. Noli me tangere. I didn't touch it. I took refuge in my analytical purity, even though I know that the price of purity is impotence. That's pure economics. Then we have the second economics, which is fundamentalist economics, to which I referred before, and I gave the example of Hayek. Fundamentalist economics identifies the abstract idea of maximizing rationality with the market, and much more momentously then makes a second identification of the market with a particular market order, with a particular version of the market, a particular version of contract, a particular version of property. And that's why I cited the example of Hayek, and saying facetiously, Hayek imagines that if Robinson Crusoe traded long enough on his island, he would eventually reproduce the whole system of 19th century German private law. And why did he think that? It's because he believed that latent, inherent in free and equal coordination and exchange between isolated economic agents are the same structures. So, for example, in the contract law that evolved in the West over the last century and a half, the central model of contract is the bilateral executory promise, which is a fully articulated bargain for an instantaneous exchange of performances at some moment in the future. This version of contract, in reality, in legal and social reality, is surrounded by a host of exceptions, of which the most important is the relational contract. So the relational contract is a series of performance, is a not fully articulated bargain to organize a series of exchanges in the future between the same participants, the same agents. The real object of the relational contract are not those performances. The real object is the development of the relation itself, which then has a potential to generate new exchanges and new performances in the future. That is central to social life. In fact, more central, one might say, than this exceptional paradigm of the bilateral executory promise. But it's not fully articulated. It's always incomplete. It's an incomplete contract. It's a continuing contract in time. It organizes a series of exchanges, and the series of exchanges are just instances of the fecundity of the relation. So is that not part of a market? Or could we not have an idea of a market in which the relational contract would be more central than the bilateral executory promise? Now, you can say the same thing about property. The ghost in the machine, the central element in the modern idea of property, is the unified property right, which was theorized in the 19th century. All the component powers of property, what a Savinian calls possession, usufruct, the claim to the income stream, and alienation, the right to buy and sell, are brought together. All of these component powers of property are brought together, assembled under the aegis of the same category, and vested in the same right holder, the owner. So the owner is the absolute owner, perpetual in time and absolute in control in the exercise of the right. That's the absolute property right, which in this idea is the model of property. Our relation is not to the thing, our relation is to one another. And the thing is just is as it were the pretext or the reference. So to go back to the example of Robinson Crusoe, and one of the great narrative principles of the early modern English novel, Robinson Crusoe accumulated things on his island. Why did he accumulate things? He accumulated things so as not to depend on people. So the essence of accumulation was as an accumulation of things was to serve as an alternative to solidarity, to human connection. That's the reason for the accumulation of things. Eventually, Robinson Crusoe got lonely and missed the company of his friends in England, so he escaped his island and went back. So, absolute unified property is an expression of a particular economic order, which some might call capitalism, but I would just say it's the market. It's a version of the market. And just as the bilateral executory promise is surrounded by a host of anomalies or exceptions, so too the unified property right is an anomaly in the history of law. In most periods in the history of law, in all the major legal traditions of the world, the typical form of property has been its disaggregation into component powers that are vested in different tiers of claimants. Now, in the contemporary economies, the most salient or notable form of this disaggregation is in financial markets. Contemporary financial markets are markets in financial derivatives. And what are financial derivatives? In the legal vocabulary, financial derivatives are markets in the disaggregated component powers of property. But couldn't that disaggregation be used for a completely different purpose? Of course. As in my thought experiment of the rotating capital auction. The means of production are vested in funds. The funds auction off the means of production to those who can use them most effectively. So, fundamentalist economics is the second type of economics with respect to the idea of institutions that results from marginalism. There's pure economics and there's fundamentalist economics. Fundamentalist economics has great potency because it has very specific institutional implications. It says, organize the market order according to the categories of 19th century German private law, the absolute property right, the bilateral executory promise, and so forth. But from a theoretical standpoint, from the standpoint of the austere and heroic assumptions of marginalism, it's an impure economics. So its fecundity in practical implications is just the reverse side of its impurity. Now, the third type of economics, from the standpoint of the imagination of institutions, is what I would call equivocating economics. And it is exemplified by the analytical and argumentative practice of the American macroeconomists, who began as the American followers of Keynes. And I'm going to say a word about Keynes if there's time later on in the class. So the object of this equivocating economics is to establish law-like relations among large-scale economic aggregates, like, for example, the levels of saving, employment, and inflation. So, for example, the so-called Phillips curve that pretends or proposes to establish a law-like relation between the level of employment or unemployment and the level of inflation. There's a natural rate of inflation, of employment, and if you inflate more than that allows, then there'll be unemployment. Now then, these claims are attacked. Say they're attacked by a critic, and the critic says, this is false, this is specious, this claim that there are these law-like relations. These so-called law-like relations depend on a whole host of background institutional assumptions. Are the workers organized? How are they organized? Is there unemployment insurance? Who controls, who dictates monetary policy, and so forth. If you change any detail of that background, these law-like relations will vanish, and you'll have another relation. And in fact, the so-called Phillips curve vanished. It turned out not to be reliable. But if in the society in which the economist lives and works, most of these institutional arrangements are de facto stable or stagnant, he can disregard his concession and go back to what he was doing before. So you make the objection, you say, no, you don't have a right to call this a law. This is just an appearance of a law. You're confusing stability or stagnation with lawfulness. It depends on all these background presuppositions. Change any of those presuppositions and your law will vanish. So what should he say? He should say, yes, you're right. What a lawyer would call confession and demur. He says, yes. But then he goes back to what he was doing before, because if there's actual stagnation, the argumentative concession can be disregarded in practice. That's the nature of this equivocating economics. So pure economics, fundamentalist economics, and equivocating economics are three different ways of evading the problem of structure, or misrepresenting it, of falsifying its true nature. And they are the substance of what this economics has to teach us about institutions. So would someone like to speak to that? That's a vigorous polemic against the position of the contemporary economics with respect to institutions. Would someone speak up for economics or cast a different view? Yes.
I generally agree with the way you framed it, but
Yeah.
I would say, like, the Phillips curve example is actually maybe a good example, depending on which economist you talk to, of one where we'll have tried to use the empirics to revisit the theoretical.
Yes.
And maybe that's a point in favor of economics.
So, but the question is are there any law-like relations that are not of this character, that are not dependent on this detailed institutional background and the change with it? Now, if we go back to the question of Marxism, Marxism has a very general and abstract idea of what the system is. It doesn't describe the system at the level of requisite detail to include stuff like all of the arrangements and ideologies that are necessary to explain the Phillips curve when it operated, right? So it's at the wrong level of concreteness. Yes.
So when we're talking about stagnation, I think, is it really stagnation, or if, as you were saying, when you talk about the importance of institutions, so for instance, war, right? Like it could be suppression instead of stagnation. It could be that the way that the mode of production has been entrenched is unequal, and that, for instance, labor is losing power. So I think when economists make all these graphs, they're not taking into account the political situation of what's happening.
But what's the implication? What are you arguing there?
Well, okay, and I'm a lawyer, not an economist.
Yes.
So I do have to admit that. But it seems to me that when they're trying to balance inflation, you can't have the interest rate, you have to have the interest rate high to balance inflation, and then you can't have too many people have higher wages, because that also leads to inflation. I mean, that just seems to me like a rigged system, because against labor. Because if wages go up.
Well, I understand, but what you're saying is that there are a plurality of possible interventions, any one of which would change that phenomenon which is being described as the Phillips curve.
Yeah,
So that's agreeing with what I said, right?
yeah,
I
I'm not
mean,
disagreeing with
so,
you.
I mean, Keynes, so this, of course, all this is understood in the modern economy in the light of Keynes's ideas. And I'm going to say a word about Keynes if there's occasion later. And Keynes's ideas were deliberately tailored or suited to the political situation which he encountered. So that's why his occasional pieces, his journalistic writings of the 1920s, are in many respects more profound than his theoretical work. So in those earlier journalistic writings, he considered, and later in the 30s, he considered a number of possible responses to the Depression. And some of them involved gaining political control, political influence over the investment decision, rather than manipulation of demand. But he rejected those ideas because he thought they would associate him with the left. So the premise of his theoretical work is a pre-theoretical political choice. That's, I'll focus on demand because the demand will associate me with the liberals, whereas the response to the Depression through control over the investment decision would associate me with the socialists. But that only shows that this isn't a system which has one trick to it. There are many forms of intervention and transformation. And so we don't want to have a body of theoretical ideas that induces in us this illusion that there's one problem and there's one solution to it, when in fact there's this plurality. And that's the problem, which is being denied to us by this way of describing the institutional background. You were going to say something more?
Yeah, I was going to suggest that, or we're trying to find one of these law-like relationships, the relationship between price and quantity for most goods and services that are desired, unless there's some meaningful intervention, subsidized taxes and so on. Maybe that is one that, namely supply and demand, as it's sort of sketched out in the most basic.
But what about supply and demand?
So I was gonna, so you were suggesting like maybe there aren't any law-like relationships that economists, like contemporary economists sort of rest on.
So there are many ways in which supply and demand can come into disequilibrium, right? And one of the things to say about Keynes is that his theory, contrary to the title, a general theory, isn't a general theory. It's a theory of one particular kind of slump, one particular kind of recession or downturn or depression, a kind that combined inadequate demand with the diversion of saving into unproductive hoarding, with the fixity of a particular price, which is what he called the downward rigidity of labor. The wage can go up, but it can't go down. So it's a very particular kind of slump. It's not a general theory of slumps. If it were a general theory of slumps, it would be a theory of all the ways in which breakthroughs in the constraints on supply and breakthroughs in the constraints on demand can fail to reinforce one another. That would be a general theory of slumps. So you can imagine, on the supply side, what can a model firm do? It can simply wait for there to be demand. It can build up inventory in anticipation of future demand. It can innovate in innovations that that increase efficiency, but typically are capital sparing, or it can do what the business schools now call disruptive innovation. That is, it can invest in technologies and business models that create new demands and new markets that didn't exist before. That's on the supply side. On the demand side, how does demand increase? It can increase by credit, which is a kind of pseudo increase of purchasing power, which is an important part of the background to the run-up to the crisis of 2007, 2008 in the rich countries, a kind of fake credit democracy replacing a property-owning democracy. It can increase as a result of compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. And it can increase by actual redistribution through change in access to assets. Now, so these are qualitative distinctions on the supply side and qualitative distinctions on the demand side. No particular progression on one side automatically produces a corresponding response on the other side. That's the real basis of this disequilibrium of supply and demand. There's no theory of that. That's not the object of Keynes's theory. That would be a general theory, but we don't have that general theory. And so that's also by way of showing that this wasn't produced. The theory that would help us understand the transformation of these realities. So I'm saying that the economics that exists conceals the true nature of institutions in all these ways. And it establishes this antithesis in which if it's pure and coherent and rigorous, it's empty. That's pure economics. If it has institutional implications, it's delusive. It's false consciousness, either in the form of, in the brutal, crude form of fundamentalist economics, or in the subtle, evasive form of equivocating economics. So, to my mind, there's no way to study this stuff without innovating in the nature of economic knowledge. To progress, we need a different kind of economics. In the past, I taught a course under this title with my friend and colleague, Danny Roderick. And this was the subject on which we diverged. That is, Roderick was very sympathetic to all practical transformations, but he was very opposed to any attack on the central core of the marginalist economics. So what has happened then? In the way in which these ideas have been processed in the contemporary world. Keynes' system, about which I'll say something later, Keynes' system was reduced by his American followers into the theory of counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy. And it was labeled macroeconomics. So Keynes' system had the potential to be a rival way of understanding the economy. It wasn't developed into that, and the person at fault for that underdevelopment was Keynes himself. And there are reasons for that. Keynes was very worldly, he wanted to shine. The worldly are unable to change the world. And if you want to shine, if you want to win prizes, if you want to exert influence, forget it. You can't transform anything that really matters. And he did these series of shortcuts or adaptations of his ideas to the situation, which diminished its significance. Then his American followers, taking advantage of the road that he had already prepared, converted, defanged his system even more. They took out the poison, the subversive element, and reduced it into this theory of counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy, which it has then become. So now you open a textbook in economics, and the economics that the marginalists created at the end of the 19th century is there. That's microeconomics. And the economics, which is this theorization of counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy, is in the same textbook, labeled macroeconomics. So what was initially intended to be, or had the potential to be, a rivalry between two ways of doing economics, ends up as two chapters in the same book, as if it were just two parts of the same system. The last episode of the story is exactly what you would expect. Once all contention between the two ways of thinking had been avoided and resolved, then comes the attempt to show that what's novel in the new set of ideas isn't true, and what's true is a novel. So that's the right-wing attack on Keynesianism within economics is that. And that goes under the label of the micro foundations of macroeconomics. The point of this work of the micro foundations of macroeconomics is to show that everything that is legitimate in these ideas is already implicit or presaged in the marginalist economics. We don't need Keynes. And now I want to say one final word which may seem strange to you, but it composes this picture. There's something called the Nobel Prize in Economics, which is an invention. The family of Alfred Nobel had established at the start of the 20th century a series of prizes in the sciences. In the middle of the 20th century, in Sweden, the Swedish central bank, the Riksbank, was in conflict with the social democratic governments which had political hegemony in the Sweden of that time. And they very cleverly decided that they could increase the prestige of economics by endowing a prize in the name of Alfred Nobel, which they cynically called the Nobel Prize in the Economic Sciences given in honor of the memory of Alfred Nobel. The family of Alfred Nobel brought a lawsuit in Stockholm to prevent them from doing this. And they lost the lawsuit because, as you can imagine, it's very hard to prevent someone from pretending to pay homage to the memory of a dead person by giving his name to a prize. So they lost this, and so this prize was created. And every year, a few representatives of the pseudoscience stand up in Stockholm and receive this prize. Normally, they are completely mechanical practitioners of this intellectual tradition. But from time to time, a member of the loyal opposition is also included as one of the recipients of the prize. And this is what we have. So this is the world. This is how it functions. Just so you understand the larger context of these ideas. Any comment? And then I'll say a word about Keynes before we end. Yes.
Where would you say the economists, as described, without entering to discuss that, influence the practical world? The question comes around, do you think it's around ideology shaping politics, world policy? Because in my practical experience, for example, working with private companies, it's not that these mechanical practitioner approaches are embedded in our day-to-day. So at which level do these economists...
I think it's a very interesting question, but I think it's the cumulative, it seems to me that it's the cumulative effect on our imaginative horizon of the possible, in which the prestige of analytical work, the mathematical models, the formal discourse, the immense influence of the economics departments of the American research universities is committed to this idea that this is all somehow natural or necessary. So it's an element in the imposition of the dictatorship of no alternatives in the world. That's what I think, in which the style of rationality, of discourse, of the managerial classes receives the support of the science, in quotes, the pseudoscience, receives the prizes of the world, the glories of the world. And they all reinforce one another. And who is the opponent? The opponent is Karl Marx, who never received an academic position, who spent thousands of nights alone in the British Library, or in the reading room of the British Museum. And so you're either in or you're out. So this is the triumph of the insiders and the imaginative world evoked by this insiderdom. Doesn't that seem to you to be the most essential element?
In my opinion, being both an economist and having practiced real economics in industrial companies, I don't think that the ideas of economics that would ideologically shape the limited institutional imagination affect the functionings of the real world in such a way so that imagination is impossible in practice. What I mean, for example, is I think private companies do experiment with markets and market forms and alternative contract forms much more than what this economic theory orthodoxy.
I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure that a CEO of the American tech oligopolies is more likely to have transformative ideas about the economy than a member of one of these economics faculties of the American universities. But the ideas are likely to be limited, not because the person intends to be oligarchic, but for lack of imagination, lack of knowledge of the world. So I don't think that there's a direct functional relation of the kind of economics ideas that I've been describing to the imposition of this dictatorship of no alternatives. It seems to me that it's, the main effect is purely negative. That is, these aren't ideas that are in any way subversive or challenging. They don't open up a new field of possibility for humanity. And in that way they serve to preserve the situation. And because they combine the sense of the naturalness or necessity of what exists with intellectual prestige, which has an immense significance. Is that not enough? I ask you, is that not enough?
One could consider that imagination is, as you very well said, not so limited in certain realms. Think, for example, of the artificial intelligence revolution.
Yes.
You could argue that
Absolutely.
its leaders are not necessarily limited by...
No, they're not. No, I think so. I think that many of the technologists and managers of these companies have entertained these ideas about possibility. They maybe haven't thought them out in this comprehensive form that we're trying to do here, but they would be sympathetic to them. Much more so than the economists. So the economists are the seat of orthodoxy. You know, they have a science which is not a real science, which is a pseudoscience in all these ways that I'm describing. The experience of talking to them is very different from the experience of talking, for example, with physicists or cosmologists. The real scientists are much more open than the pseudoscience. So the pseudoscientists are defensive. They're opposed to a larger idea of possibility. But isn't that, whereas the real scientists are much more interested in criticism of their discipline and alternative possibilities. Isn't that exactly what one would expect? Now, in the intellectual history of all of this, a complication was Keynesianism. And Keynesianism is an episode worth considering. So, in many parts of the world, when the leftists abandoned faith in a transformative project, they became vulgar Keynesians. For example, in my country, in Brazil, there are no real Marxist economists, but there are lots of these vulgar Keynesian economists. Vulgar Keynesianism substitutes for Marxism in the world. And Keynes's economics was a simulacrum of an apostasy, right? It's an unaccomplished heresy, weighted down by many intellectual and moral concessions from Keynes himself. So what are the essential characteristics of Keynes's economics? First of all, unlike what I'm claiming about Marxist economics, it wasn't just a logical system, but it did persist in the psychological rather than the institutional emphasis of English political economy. So all the crucial categories in Keynes's system, the liquidity preference, the propensity to consume, the state of long-term expectations are psychological categories. The institutional element appears in Keynes only in respect to particular parts of the market order, like, for example, the stock market, but not with respect to the market order as a whole. Now, second, it's an economic theory that shares with this tradition the emphasis on the demand side rather than on the supply side. There's no theory of breakthroughs on the constraints on the supply side. There are only breakthroughs of the constraints on the demand side. And in order correctly to understand disequilibrium in the economy, you have to take into account the relation, the qualitative heterogeneity of these successive breakthroughs on both the supply side and the demand side, and their relation to each other. Now, that then explains the third limitation of Keynes's system, which is it's not a general theory, as I said before. It's a theory of a particular kind of slump, a slump characterized by inadequate demand, by unproductive hoarding, and by the rigidity of a particular price, the downward rigidity of the wage, of labor. And the fourth characteristic, which is for a theoretician the most interesting, is that it's caught in between two stages, or two things. It's caught in between being a theory of equilibrium at a low level of economic activity and being a theory of permanent and general disequilibrium in the economy. It's in between those two stages. And what explains all of these inadequacies is not just intellectual provincialism of a kind, but worldliness, the desire to please, to shine, to win, to prosper in the world. That's why I brought up the little narrative about the Nobel Prize. So, you know, in Rembrandt has a famous portrait of Aristotle. And Aristotle is wearing a golden chain. And there's some interpretation, and Aristotle, after all, was a great philosopher, but the golden chain means the world. And you can't be worldly if you want to change the world. It's as simple as that. Now we have some time. These are very weighty matters. Next week, we'll go back to the discussion of inequality, which I anticipated before, and the relation of inequality to structural change. And I'm going to repeat and develop some of what I had said on that earlier occasion. But what about this? Yes?
I asked for your advice on what we should take away from today's class. I think one of the key takeaways for me is that economics are a constraint on our ability to think more transformatively about systemic change.
Well, you know, this is very difficult. This is very difficult because if you see what the structure of influence and power in the world is, it's immensely useful to have formal training in economics, to have doctoral degrees from these famous research universities and their economic programs. But it's terrible to offer that as advice to anyone, because to carry out this program that is implicit in our class today, you have to go in, you have to master all of that. You have to deal with a series of hostile people who are intolerant of intellectual opposition and subversion. And intolerant not just because of ideology, but because of ignorance. Almost universally, they don't know the history of economics itself, much less the history of the economy. And so you have to go and perform to them and show proficiency at what they value, but at the same time go beyond that, supersede that. Well, who can do that? That's crucifixion. So I can't, I mean, I'm saying that that's the path, but it's a stony path. It's a path of thorns. That's what. Now, I think that I can say a word about what one can do by way of intellectual formation, not just in economics, but this is a general advice. So, of course, with respect to economics, the first thing to do is to study the history of economics. If you don't know what the economists have thought, you're completely lost. You're at the mercy of just the ideas that are around you. So you have to read firsthand these works of Smith, of Marx, of Keynes. You would be astonished. They haven't read Keynes, really. So they haven't, for the most part, they haven't read anything beyond their immediate world. Now, and then, so then now, let me broaden the conversation now. What can you expect from the university? So, the university is good at some things and bad at other things. What a university is good at, for the most part, is acquiring specific skills in particular disciplines, like how to read German, how to solve problems in mathematical physics, or something like that. What the university is paradoxically bad at is thinking, ideas. That's very bad at that. And so I don't think it's reasonable to expect to be educated in classrooms, in courses. The fundamental premise of a course is that it's something that couldn't be replaced by a book. And by that simple standard, the vast majority of courses that are taught shouldn't be taught at all. And then what can you expect in your higher education? If you're very, very lucky, and you really shouldn't expect this luck, you can hope to find along the way 2 or 3 people who can inspire you. If you find that, it's fabulous. Huh? But that's way more lucky than you should believe yourself entitled to expect. And so you have to take your education into your own hands, because otherwise you can't escape the gravitational field of the ideas that are around you. The most common defect in the education of educated people is an inadequate acquaintance with the history of philosophy. Because the history of philosophy is the history of the basic ideas in our civilization. This is a defect that can be readily remedied. And I suggest 2 techniques. The first technique is to read on the history of philosophy. The best account in English of the history of philosophy are the 9 volumes of the aristocratic English Jesuit Frederick Copplestone, which are available readily at paperback on Amazon, and you can order and you can read over a single summer, all 9 volumes. Very easy to do. The reason why I recommend Copplestone is that Copplestone isn't opinionated. Most of the history of philosophies are like the history of Western philosophy by Bertrand Russell, full of the opinions of the author about what's good or bad. Copplestone gives you a detailed account of the doctrines with very little taking of sides. So you should read Copplestone. And the second thing is you should choose one philosopher, one thinker, and read everything he ever wrote. And it's not necessarily a thinker with to whom you're sympathetic or whom you feel is sympathetic to your way of thinking. It could be a thinker who is the opposite of the way you think. But one thinker, and study everything he wrote and thought. And then form your mind in dialogue or in tension with his. That's the second. And in secondary works, I also recommend a book. I don't think there's another chart here. Oh, here. It's a translation from the French. Raymond Aron. 2 volumes, Main Currents of Sociological Theory. It's an excellent book to study the history of classical social theory. So you can study the history of philosophy, study the history of social thought. Don't expect to be educated in classes and courses and so forth. Form yourself so you have the equipment with which to resist your time. Because otherwise you're nothing. Completely at the mercy of the ideas of your milieu. And it's a very modest degree of tenacity that is required for this. The real tenacity comes later in the struggle with worldliness. But this is something that everyone who wants to be educated should be able to do. Any questions about my advice?
Yeah.
Yes.
How can one choose a particular thinker without reading several thinkers and going through all the works of multiple thinkers?
I don't understand.
So you're saying that we should select one?
I think you should study the whole history of philosophy so you have a context. But then you should have an in-depth engagement with a particular thinker, at least one, maybe 2 or 3, but at least one. Because that's a different experience. That's an experience requiring intellectual intimacy with another mind, a great mind, and forming your mind in dialogue and in tension with that mind. And you have to be guided by your intuition of who that thinker is.
So this question actually, this is a confusion because in my undergrad, I read Marx, took a couple of courses. I was very impressed. So had I chosen, and I had taken some philosophy courses before as well, but had I chosen one particular thinker at that time, he would have been the one.
Who would have been the one?
Marx.
Marx.
But probably after going some other works or probably like taking these courses which challenge the established ideas, now I think that wouldn't have been a very good idea of restraining myself to one particular thinker. And so to me it appears that engaging with a whole lot of people with different ideas probably shape your mind in a much better way as compared to.
well, that's the purpose of studying the history of philosophy, but I just think, I recommend the experience of very detailed acquaintance with a thinker, or at least a small number of thinkers, because I think that the experience of engaging in detail with someone's mind and seeing its evolution, struggling with the mind, and as I say, can be someone whose ideas you don't appreciate. I mean, if I remember my own experience, the philosophy of Schopenhauer is in some sense the inverse of mine. So I find Schopenhauer endlessly interesting. But I think everyone should have that experience. I think the problem is not being just the victim of the ideas that accidentally, contingently are around you. This is a big problem in the university. And in general, in the university, the graduate students are the ones who suffer the most from this problem because they're the seat of orthodoxy, right? They have professional insecurity. They're concerned with what's in, what's out, what can blackball them, and they typically form an idea of their discipline in their 20s, and then they spend the rest of their lives feeding material to the slot machine. So to prevent this has to be the object. And you have to take forceful action to form a mind that can't do that. Inducing in yourself an incendiary state, fervor, ardor, and resistance, from which everything comes. So our class is over. Thank you for the opportunity.